It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we are joined by an ACR pro who is one of the most successful online tournament players of all time. He is Chris Moorman. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me on again.
So great to have you back, Chris. Okay, to this hand, it comes from day one of the Wynn 10K 10 million. The blinds were 400, 800, and both you and your villain have effective stacks of about 106,800, roughly 132 big blinds. That villain is none other than Ali Imsirovic. Under the gun, 8-handed, Ali opens to 1,800. Chris, you note here that it was a good table with not too many notables at it. Does that make you widen his range? And if so, by how much?
Yeah, the thing was as well, we'd been playing for a number of hours. So, obviously I know he's an aggressive loose player anyway at the best of times, but the table was good and we both chipped up. And it was kind of like a situation where he was raising a lot of pots, I was raising a lot of pots. So we weren't getting too involved with each other just because of the positions. Like obviously he had position on me, but even considering he had position on me, he wasn't going too crazy on me kind of thing. So yeah, he'd been open a lot. And even though he's under the gun, 8-handed, I still expect him to have a much wider range than you normally would.
I love how you've put in the qualifier. We've been taking turns picking on the weaker players, and we're going to stay out of each other's way right before you absolutely doubt right now. But so, as I said, he opens to 1,800. Action folds around to you in the small blind. You call with the ace-9 of diamonds. The big blind also makes the call. This all feels super standard, so I think let's get straight to the flop. There's 6,200 in the pot, and it comes the 10 of diamonds, 9 of clubs, 8 of spades. You and the big blind check, and Ali bets 2K. You call, and the big blind folds. This also feels super standard, but I feel like this type of board where there are probably a lot of checkbacks from Ali, actually. So I'm inclined to think that he does have something. Dara, is that normally a reasonable assumption?
I definitely don't think he's range betting here, but then I don't think he'd even be doing that heads up either. This is a board which doesn't really favor his range all that much. I wouldn't quite couch it as he has to have something to bet, but let's say he's not going to be betting just 100% of the time. He's going to bet whatever his value hands are and then the appropriate bluffs that go with that.
Yeah, I expected him to check back the flop a decent amount of times. So when he bet the flop, actually, if I didn't have the backdoor nut flush draw, I might have just folded my hand then, even though sometimes I'm folding the best hand, but it's just a really hard hand for me to improve with. And, I'm out of position. He's betting three ways after raising under the gun. So it's not like a case of I thought I was ahead, but obviously I could improve to a nut hand. And yeah, once he bet the flop, I was figuring I was up against a decent hand. I even think some of his value range will check back here a lot on the flop, because this doesn't really want to get check raised. Maybe like he might slow play kings, so I can just sort of take a free card and see what happens on the turn. So yeah, when he bet the flop here, I thought he could definitely have a strong hand, but obviously I can turn a diamond, can turn a 9, lots of good stuff can still happen. So I just peeled one off, cheap price as well. It didn't bet that big, so.
Yep, that all makes an awful lot of sense. Well, to the more interesting streets, the turn comes the 9 of hearts. So the board now reads 10 of diamonds, 9 of clubs, 8 of spades, 9 of hearts. It's completely rainbow. Again, you check, and again, Ali bets, this time 7K into 10,200. Again, you call. Chris, we talk a lot about mixing. When there are multiple viable actions of roughly equal merit to be unpredictable and unexploitable, we do each at some frequency. Is this a spot where you would mix calls and raises?
Yeah, but it's like a weird spot because I actually think a lot of times when you turn trips, you might want to lead here as well. But with it being a freeway pot on the flop and him betting the flop freeways, I don't know. I felt like it was a spot where actually I wouldn't play that many check raises on the turn. And also on the flop, I wouldn't really raise with a player. I don't think I'd raise any hand on the flop with a player to act behind. So it's definitely a much more interesting spot than if it was heads up, where there'll be a lot more leads than check raises. Even though it's heads up on the turn, the fact that it was freeways on the flop changes things a little bit, in my opinion. So yeah, I decided not to lead the flop, and I decided that I wouldn't, in this particular scenario, I probably wouldn't have check raised anything on the turn either, especially versus that sizing. Maybe if you bet a smaller sizing, I could raise, but I think versus 70%, I'd just continue with a lot of calls there.
Very good. Well, Dara, I know you have run this one through a solver, and I think it actually bears out pretty much what Chris has just said.
Yeah, the solver doesn't do any leading in this spot at all with any hand, including this one, obviously. And in terms of how it plays its range, it does do a lot of check calling. It does some check raising as well. And this hand is infrequent check raise, but it's mostly just a check call. And I think Chris's point about the fact that it's three-way changes things slightly too is a good one as well. I think that leans us even more towards check calling.
Very good. Well, to the river, the pot is 24,200 and it comes the 5 of spades. You check and Ali bets 36,500, 1.5x pot. In response, you shove for 96,000, turning your hand into a bluff. Ali went to the river with roughly 105k, so that's most of his stack. He'd only be left with about 9k behind. He tanks a long time and ultimately ends up folding what he claimed later, I know to you, to be a straight. Chris, talk us through your thought process here. This isn't a line that everyone would give a lot of consideration to. In fact, I think most people might just mash the call button.
Yeah, very weird spot because obviously I've got trips. My hand value is really high. But when he overbet the river, I actually thought I didn't beat that many of his value bets. Like obviously he can still be bluffing with hands, say like King Jack or something like that. So I could just call and beat bluffs. But I actually didn't think I beat that much value. A lot of his worst 9x on the flop, he might decide to check back. So I don't think he has that many worse trips for value. And obviously this sizing, it's quite a polarizing sizing. So basically his value range is like a really good 9x for trips or straight or better, basically. And with my ace-9 combo as well, I blocked a lot of his 4 houses. So I remember looking at the board for a little bit and thinking, okay, I blocked 9-8 suited. You know, obviously he can't have quad 9s. Yeah, sure, I can still run into the nuts sometimes. And he's uncapped. I'm uncapped as well because, as I said, I wouldn't have raised with a full house at any point before this. And I think it gets a lot of credibility because if you have ace-9 here, you would just expect someone to call. They've got trips. You don't really expect them to bluff. So basically, you don't have many bluffs here in this spot anyway. And to have a bluff, it probably needs to have a 9 in it. And then it has to not have a full house as well. And then even like Jack 9 and Queen 9 on is good because I actually thought with this raise I could get him to fold a straight because it looks just like I have a full house like every time pretty much, which I normally would have like 90% plus of the time. So I actually don't want to have a Jack or Queen in my hand because then I'm blocking like a hand like Queen Jack or Jack 7 suited because I thought he was really wide pre that would fold potentially on the river. So decided to go for it this time. And we'd also been playing for a number of hours at the table, and I'd made a kind of a tight check back against him in a spot where it was a smallish pot, but I expected to have the best hand the majority of the time. But I also didn't think he would call my bet very often, and he could also potentially put me in the cage by just check shoving for 10 times the pot, the way the hand played out, because I was pretty capped. So I didn't want to put myself in that position where was I going to call off super light for all my chips. So I just decided to check back. And it was one of those ones where you can look a bit like, not scared money, but like you're not going to be taking some super high variance bluff against him in the future kind of thing.
No, I like that. I think that adds to the leveling war of it all. And I think that's a really interesting extra point. Dara, this hand reminds me a little bit of a Jack Sinclair hand I know we covered. Again, it was years ago, so I'm not going to remember the details. But it was a hand where basically Jack was in a spot where he was probably going to have to fold. But when his opponent overbet the pot, it actually opened the door for a very convincing story. Whereas if the opponent had bet small and he raised, it wouldn't really have told the same story. And I suppose that's what I was thinking when I looked at this one. It was sort of like, oh, well, the very fact that it's an overbet means he's really told a very consistent story for Queen Jack all the way. And now this is an amazing both hand selection and opportunity to really look incredibly strong with this raise. I know, again, you put this through the solver, and we were joking about it right before we started recording that it ends up being kind of quite standard in the eyes of the solver, where again, I don't think this is a hand that people would assume is standard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I saw this hand first, I looked at the river and it was like, wow, that's a really interesting line. Chris nailed it very well there. I think a really important takeaway for our listeners is when you are considering a bluff raise like this, you need to think about what you're trying to get to fold exactly. And the reason why that's important is when you're selecting a hand to use as a bluff, you want to have blockers. Obviously, in this case, you want to block houses. As Chris said, he's blocking 10-9, 9-8. He's also blocking quads, obviously. But you also want to think in terms of unblockers. You don't want to be blocking the hands that you're actually trying to get to fold. And Chris identified that the hands he's trying to get to fold are essentially straights, of which Queen Jack is the obvious one. So actually Ace 9 is a much better bluff raise than Queen 9 or Jack 9, because they block the hands that we're trying to get folds from. And it's interesting what the solver actually does with its different nines. Ace 9 suited is the only 9x that it uses in this way. It mixes calls and bluff raises, which basically means that at equilibrium, if Ali is perfectly balanced between the hands he's supposed to be betting for value, which would mostly be straights and houses, and his bluffs, then we pretty much have a break-even call. But the fact that our blockers are good makes it also a decent bluff raise candidate. This is a spot, I think, where a lot of players would just really struggle to find bluffs. But the reality is you do have to find bluffs in every spot. When you are looking for bluffs, you want to be thinking in terms of, I want to be blocking the value, the stuff that he's not going to fold to me, houses in other words, and the 9 serves a very useful function there. And I don't want to be blocking the stuff that I'm trying to fold out, which is Queen Jack or maybe 7-6 suited, which is the other straight. That's why the solver is using Ace 9. The only other hand that the solver uses as a bluff at some frequency is 10-8 suited for the same reasons. 10-8 suited obviously blocks pocket 10s, pocket 8s, 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited. So it blocks houses and it doesn't block the straights. But it's a spot where we don't have a ton of value, so we don't need that many bluff combos. But this is definitely one of the better ones.
Brilliant stuff. Well, turning back to you, Chris, maybe finally, Dara's made the point there that you have to look at what hands you're targeting. And clearly you very much were targeting a straight Queen Jack, as he said, being the obvious one. I think when you look at the solver output, it shows that Ali would be indifferent with Queen Jack, which means that, he's probably going to be in the tank. And I suppose that all the more gives credibility to what you described as being maybe the backdrop to this hand, which was that you were generally staying away from each other. And you'd also, in the previous pot you'd played, shown yourself to, do a little nitty check back in a spot that made sense. But also he might carry that into this one for a little bit of metagame.
Yeah, and I also think, obviously, if you're playing a solver, yeah, you have to call sometimes with Queen Jack. But when you're playing certain human opponents, obviously it's easy to find the value shoves. If you have a full house, you go all in. But it's definitely a spot, I think, which is under bluffed on the whole, unless you're playing maybe in 100K tournaments, stuff like that. And the fact that we both had a good table, it just seemed like a kind of a suicidal bluff to try and, to try and get a really good hand to fold. If he's got his value hand, then he's already bet 1.5 times the pot on the river. So he's taken an incredibly strong line, betting 3 ways, 3 times, and overbetting the river. So it just seemed like a spot where I felt like he would give me credit. And to be honest, even though I could see my cards, in that situation, I would give myself credit. I don't think I would bluff Ace 9 every time. And obviously, if I had the full house, I would be shoving every time. So it's quite hard to find the bluffs. And you're always going to find the value shoves with the full house. So I would expected him to fold a straight.
Well, a terrific hand, brilliantly summed up by you there. Very well thought through and played on all streets, I felt. And one that I think actually gives an awful lot of food for thought to our listeners who may have focused on the fact that they had trips with the best kicker and not have really seen the blocker potential of the 9. Chris Moorman, thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah. A couple of other things I'd like to add is just that in that spot, sometimes it's easy to think, oh, I finally got a good hand against a really tough player who's winning, the majority of pots on the tables. You just snap call them on the river. So, you should always leave yourself open to the potential raising in certain situations. And there's probably no one else on the table that I would have tried to get to fold there, just because you have to assume your opponent's good enough to be able to fold a really strong hand. Even though you're representing a stronger hand than them, most people, if they got straight there, they're just going to be like, well, if you got it, you got it. So kind of thing. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't have gone for it against pretty much anyone else on the table.
That makes an awful lot of sense. Always sad when you look at the guy and he just kind of goes, shrug, okay.
Yeah, you got me. Yeah.
Can I re-enter when they ask that question? That's never good either. Chris Moorman, once again, thank you so much.
No problem. All right.
Thanks, Chris.